I have a belief that God exists. I mean, I think it's much more likely than not.
Sure, but I mean that's a separate question. If you believe, like, do you know with certainty that God exists?
No, I don't know with certainty. In the sense of I don't know in the way that you might ascribe one knowing that 1 + 1 equals 2.
So you discuss sort of existential arguments for God. You also discuss the moral argument, and then you talk later about objections, things like the problem of evil. So am I right in thinking that for you, because I think you say this in the book, that the moral argument is to you one of the most compelling cases?
I find the moral argument a really powerful argument for God.
Is that where you would begin with somebody? Like, if you wanted to have a conversation with somebody who was an atheist and they weren't, let's say they weren't familiar, let's say they're like a passive atheist who just doesn't have the belief, and it's your job to come and say, here's a good reason to believe, where do you begin with someone like that?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it would very much depend on the conversation I was having with them, and if it appeared that they had specific objections to God, then I might did start with those first of all. So if it's the problem of suffering or evil, and that's why I can't believe in God, I might begin there rather than somewhere else. But yeah, if I was just kind of laying out my case, if you like, to someone who's just not convinced, the moral argument would certainly be part of it. I think by its nature, it can be sort of, it's not the easiest thing to explain in a kind of 30 seconds. Yeah. So you've got to kind of be willing to kind of put the legwork in to kind of make sure that we all understand what we're talking about. I mean, in the book, I essentially lay out my general case for God, for theism, if you like. In 3 chapters, I say God is the best explanation of human existence. God is the best explanation of human value. That's really where the moral argument comes. And God is the best explanation of human purpose. And that's more an argument around meaning and that kind of thing. And so I think this might be the way I would approach it with someone who's skeptical, is to say, I think what we're doing, if you are an atheist, I'd ask, well, does that mean you're a naturalist? Does that mean you believe that all that exists are physical forces and so on? And if we can take that as our starting point, then we've got something to talk about, because there's a certain set of beliefs that entails. Because
you wrote on page 57 to 58 here of atheists. You say, logically, their atheism commits them to the view that there is nothing in the universe, that nothing more in the universe than the matter and energy that everything consists of. So is your view of atheism there a positive disbelief in God?
Well, I've preceded that by saying the majority of atheists that I do speak to about this subscribe to some kind of naturalism. So I accept that there are many atheists who simply haven't thought about it, and what their atheism really boils down to is a sort of agnosticism of they don't have a belief in God, but they haven't really thought about a positive case for that. And so I do meet a lot of atheists who say, well, the burden of proof isn't on me because I simply lack belief in God.
Like, do you agree with that? Do you think that the atheist has a burden of proof?
The problem is, for me, that there are many things that lack belief in God, stones, rocks, cats. Do we call them atheists?
Well, if let's say we define an atheist as a person who lacks belief in God, just as I think on your show, actually, I gave the example of something like veganism. If we define it as, abstaining from eating animal products, then a rock is a vegan as well. But usefully, I think what we really mean
we're talking about humans.
Yeah, a vegan is a person who abstains, and an atheist is a person who doesn't believe.
It strikes me that someone who lacks belief in God, that all you're doing there is kind of describing a psychological state of someone. And in that sense, I think the most you can say is they're sort of agnostic. Now, but if I meet someone who's giving me reasons why they don't believe God exists, I'm kind of going to assume they actually hold a positive belief.
Really?
That God does not exist, or that it's very likely that God does not exist.
Well, I'm interested in your diagnosis of agnosticism there, because do you know that God exists?
Well, I have a belief that God exists. I mean, I think it's much more likely than not.
Sure, but I mean, that's a separate question. If you believe, like, do you know with certainty that God exists?
No, I don't know with certainty. In the sense of, I don't know in the way that you might ascribe one knowing that 1 + 1 = 2.
Right.
So something like that.
I could probably say to you then, in that case, well, you don't know that God exists, so technically you're an agnostic.
Yeah, but I think the problem is that puts the category of agnostic very wide. I think it's a very broad definition of agnostic. If you're saying simply having some measure of willingness to be skeptical about your belief in God or whatever makes you an agnostic. Well, in that sense, we're all agnostics about most things in life because we could be wrong.
Are you are you the kind of Christian who, because I've met a lot of people who are of this view, that they'll accept that an atheism like mine is a passive atheism. It is just a lack of belief in God.
Right.
It's not, I don't actively believe there is no God. And yet still feel as though I have some burden of proof, because it's like I'm kind of denying some self-evident reality. I mean, you make a case that in order for value and purpose and morality and all these things to make any sense, you kind of have to believe in God. So if I just say I'm not convinced, do I still have a burden of proof there?
Well, I think you have a burden of proof if you're making claims about the way the universe is. So if you're a naturalist, Alex, I think you have a burden of proof to show why naturalism is true. So my question to you would be, so you would claim to be sort of agnostic about God, but are you agnostic about naturalism? Are you a naturalist? Or
right. And I think I would probably say that, again, it would be similar to your Christianity. It's like, yeah, I'm an agnostic because I don't know either way, and I'm not a scientist at that. But I think it's more likely true than not true that the universe is naturalistic. Now, does that commit me to naturalism to the extent that I need a burden of proof?
I think it means, I think it doesn't make sense to simply label yourself as agnostic in that sense. I think if you believe something is more likely true than not, you're in the region of being more committed to a particular position. And so I don't think it's helpful to simply label everyone agnostic if there's any measure of sort of doubt
I don't
within
know,
there.
Just leaning one way or the other might not do it. Like if we're discussing, because it was kind of overcast when we came in today, and I could say, do you think it's raining? And you say, I don't know, but it's probably more likely that it is raining than not, based on the weather that I saw earlier. Like, I'd still say that that's an agnostic position. Like, we don't know if it's raining, but even if you kind of lean one way more than the other, it's kind of a separate question whether you know it's raining to whether you believe it's raining. And it's the same thing with God, I think. So I think, like, as far as I'm concerned, in my definition of the word agnostic, which is just being in a position of admitting that you don't know, we're both agnostics and both have to be agnostics. And the difference lies in our belief rather than our knowledge.
Justin Brierley says morality points to God, but research in science and history offers a different explanation. Evolutionary biology shows that cooperation and empathy developed because they helped early humans survive in groups. Studies of chimpanzees and bonobos even show fairness, sharing, and helping behavior without any religion involved. The Bible also reflects changing moral ideas. Exodus 21 includes rules about owning slaves, and Deuteronomy 21:18-21 allows parents to have a rebellious son executed. Most Christians reject those rules today. That shift happened through human reflection and social progress. Because of this, many philosophers argue that morality grows out of human nature, culture, and reasoning. It does not require a supernatural explanation to exist.
That has to be a component of the Christian belief. What else to you lies in the real core of Christianity?
Well, for me, you could probably sum it up in something like the Apostles' Creed. I mean, that's what the creeds were developed for, was to give a sort of an easy-to-view way of looking at what are the core beliefs of a Christian. So that would include the deity of Christ, that Christ is divine, that he lived, he died for our sins, and that he rose again. The Holy Spirit, it's a Trinitarian conviction that I hold. So those would be some of, I suppose, the key elements.
And are you non-denominational?
I do belong to a denomination, but I'm non-denominational. You could say I'm non-denominational as far as the show goes. I hear from a wide variety of perspectives, different denominations when it comes to Christianity, and in the book I'm very much advocating for what C.S. Lewis called a mere Christianity, which is to say we're not going to get into the long grass of all the various things you could debate over various doctrinal positions on various things. We're just going to say, was Jesus Christ who he said he was? Did he rise from the dead? If so, we've got pretty good grounds for believing that Christianity is true.
Yeah, but before you even get to Jesus, you need to start with his dad, and that's where you kind of begin trying to put forth these arguments for the existence of God. So, well, look, why don't you try to convince me? Why don't you talk me through some of these arguments? Let's see what they're made of, why they're convincing, and areas in which I might disagree with you.
I mean, well, any one of these we could take the whole show for. So maybe we should start with one or two of the ones that I know you've been most keenly engaged with, and one of them is the moral argument.
Yeah, obviously. I think it'd be good to focus on that because I do want to get into the problem of evil as well, which is something I haven't really talked about on my channel before, and certainly not on the podcast. And I think the two are somewhat linked. They're different questions, but they lead well into each other.
And that was kind of where the whole Frank Turek thing came from as well, wasn't it? But I mean, the way I put it in the chapter is that I believe God makes sense of human value in a way that a naturalistic worldview cannot. And so it's as simple as really pointing out that a lot of people believe that there is an intrinsic value and dignity to human life, that somehow we should treat humans in a way that we're not obliged to treat the rest of the world, the living world. And even, some humanist manifestos, I don't know if you think of yourself as a humanist, Alex, but they're obviously the ethical framework that I meet many atheists that they hold is some form of humanism. And if you look at some of the declarations that have been made around that, they seem to very intrinsically hold humans as having a special status. And we have whole documents of human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We had the 70th anniversary of that recently. And the question is, well, if these human rights, this human value, this intrinsic human dignity does exist, if people are agreed on that, how do we ground that? And my view is that theism, Christianity specifically, is a good grounding for it, because a Christian believes that God has created humans in his image. That gives humans a sort of intrinsic dignity and value and worth. And in fact has shown that as well in his death on the cross, in reconciling humanity to himself in that way. But I don't find any justification for that belief in a naturalist atheist view of reality, where we are, in a sense, a somewhat random byproduct of a purposeless, process of evolution. I don't see in a world that is essentially, you can boil down to matter in motion, molecules and so on, where this intrinsic dignity and value lies. And I suspect you might say the same, because I know you're a subjectivist when it comes to morality, that there isn't any objective standard out there to which we're...
I mean, it's complicated because it sounds as though, and like, I think you're right, but perhaps for the wrong reasons to call me a subjectivist. It sounds like you are just trying as hard as you can to avoid subjectivism, moral subjectivism. It sounds like your argument is based on the idea that we must have some conception that people are valuable as a matter of fact, and that it is wrong to throw acid in the face of a girl. FGM is wrong, and we need.
I believe that is wrong. I believe it's subjectively wrong. All I'm saying is that if you hold the belief that it's wrong, that it's objectively wrong, and that humans do have some intrinsic value, then you can't believe that your naturalism won't support that.
And to be clear, you're not saying that people who don't have a belief in God or some higher being can't have those moral convictions.
Oh, no. And that's the big mistake that often gets made. People confuse this idea that what I'm saying is atheists can't be moral people. Yeah. That nothing could be further from the truth. Many of the atheists I know are incredibly moral beings.
They just can't justify the morality.
I just don't believe they can justify it on the basis of their worldview.
And that's because...
And it's a kind of a leap of faith almost that takes place when they say, but I just believe humans have this intrinsic value and dignity. And I'm like, well, great, so do I, but I don't believe you have a grounds for believing that.
So why does God provide that basis in a way that atheistic worldviews can't?
Well, simply because I think if we are created in the image of God, and God is the creator of everything, and God is the ultimate source of good and value and love, then there seems to be a natural, relationship there between us having been endowed with this specific value that we recognize.
Right. And
I can't give you a mechanistic account of that, obviously.
But
I think that it makes more sense of our fundamental belief if we have one.
Sure. And so when it comes to, because it does come down to the idea of being made in the image of God, I presume that you're somebody who generally accepts the scientific literature on evolution.
Yeah, I mean, with some caveats, but I'm very happy to say if that's the best explanation going, then that's the best explanation.
Right, and that's a good way of looking at it. So, but my question would be something like, if human value is predicated on the idea that human beings are made in the image of God and that they are special, they have some kind of special worth, then if you trace the evolutionary heritage of human beings, you get back to a kind of apish ancestor which doesn't resemble humans and clearly wasn't made in the image of God. So I struggle to get my head around the idea that we can have a kind of a fish and then billions of years of evolution, and at some point along that chain, okay, around about here, this is where we're now in the image of God. It seems like if you're made in the image of God, there needs to be this immediate creation of humanity as it exists, because otherwise you run into a problem of degree.
Yeah.
Justin moves the discussion toward the core beliefs of Christianity, especially the idea that human value comes from being created in God's image. But Alex raises a key challenge here when evolution enters the picture. Modern biology shows that humans did not appear suddenly. We developed gradually through a long chain of ancestors stretching back hundreds of millions of years. Fossil records and genetics confirm that humans share a common ancestry with other animals. That raises a serious question for the theological claim. If human dignity comes from being uniquely created in God's image, where exactly in that evolutionary chain does that begin? Was it with early Homo sapiens or earlier hominins like Homo erectus? The science shows a gradual transition, not a clear dividing line. That makes the theological claim difficult to pin down, because the biological evidence does not show a moment where humanity suddenly becomes something fundamentally different.
I've got in your book, which I can also quote from, you've said, for this reason, and it's kind of discussing the things you've just been discussing, many people claim that morality is entirely subjective. You say, this means that there are no universal standards of good and evil, but that individuals decide for themselves what is right or wrong depending on their cultural circumstances and personal point of view. Now, to me, that kind of confuses moral subjectivism with moral relativism, and they're often thrown in the same bag. But I believe that to be a moral subjectivist isn't to say that morality varies by culture. You still run into the problem of the grounding for it, and is it just as arbitrary as 5 fingers instead of 4? But I could ask the same question to you. I'm sure you're familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma, but for those who aren't, who are listening, the question is asked, is that which is good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? And you can't say that God commands it because it's good, because then there's some standard of good that exists outside of God, and he's not omnipotent. But that implies that the reason things are good is because God says they are.
And then it seems arbitrary.
Surely that makes it just as arbitrary, because again, you also believe that the reason you have 5 fingers instead of 6 is because God made it so. And so is it not still just as arbitrary that you're made with 6 instead of 5 instead of 6 fingers?
Many philosophers have dealt perfectly satisfactorily with the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro, I can't remember how to pronounce it properly, but and William Lane Craig has obviously said, you simply split the horns of this dilemma, and the third option is that good is God. The good is, by God's very nature, is good, and therefore you don't have this idea that God's either subject to the good or is arbitrarily defining the good. Goodness is God, essentially, and I'm satisfied with that. I think that at the core of this, God is intrinsically moral.
Right, but in an ethical framework, someone could just turn around and say that hedonism is intrinsically moral, as John Stuart Mill essentially does. And I don't see why it's more compelling to point to God and say, well, we just, because if you kind of accept the Euthyphro dilemma and you say, well, let's have a conversation about this, like, let's see how God is the author of good, and when we run into problems like this, how we can solve them. But if your answer to it is to just say, well, good is God, then I don't see why that's any more compelling than me just finding any other kind of naturalistic quality and saying this is what we identify as good. That's essentially what Sam Harris does as well, when he identifies touching a hot stove as bad, and he just says, like, there's no denying that's bad, like almost definitionally so. It's about kind of avoidance of pain.
Then I would have to say, but what you're saying there is therefore everything is subjective, regardless of whether it's got a religious basis or a kind of naturalist basis.
In an ethical sense, perhaps. Yeah.
And I just think that actually, no, I am aware. I apprehend that moral facts exist and moral values and duties exist. And all I'm trying to do is say what grounds this. And although I can't give you a sort of complete definition of how God grounds the good, I'm far more convinced that God gives a satisfactory grounding for that than naturalism, which I don't believe gives a grounding for it at all. And I think you're in agreement with that.
But that's, I mean, what is it about having a God? What is it about having a supernatural being that allows you to say that we now have a basis for morality?
Because that being is not just another being in the universe or in reality. That being is the ground of reality. That everything that exists within the purposes and mind of that being. That being is reality, almost, you could say.
Right.
And in that sense, it's not some being arbitrarily deciding what is good and bad. It's the very notion of good and bad exist within that being. That it's the ground of being able to talk about morality.
But like you point out there, that makes God the grounding of both good and evil.
Well, makes God the grounding of being able to distinguish between them. Yeah.
Do you think that God is the author of evil?
No.
No evil whatsoever.
Well, I don't believe that God wills evil, if that's what you're asking.
That's not what I'm asking.
Okay.
Although I was going to ask you a similar question, which is that this view of God as the foundation of reality, is that to you inconsistent with the view that God is malicious? Could it be the case that God is the grounding of reality and is the beginning and the alpha and the omega, and yet is malicious?
No, I don't feel that makes sense. I know there is the evil God argument from Stephen Lawrence, but I've always felt that I suppose it's an intuition ultimately that goodness, love, the things we label good, they are, if you like, the things that I would naturally ascribe with a being that you would give the qualities of God, essentially. And it seems to me an unnecessary sort of skeptical view to say, but it could be that God is actually an evil God who is intent on producing evil in the world. I suppose it's my experience, my personal experience to some extent is the basis on which I would say that I don't believe it's an evil God behind this universe. And the experience of love itself makes me believe that if a God was really an evil God trying to extract the maximum amount of suffering and evil from the universe, it doesn't seem like a good way of doing it.
Well, that's an interesting point. I just wanted to make sure that because I want to pick up on this when we discuss the problem of evil very shortly. That's an interesting point to consider. It's like, is it conceivable that with the evil in the universe right now, we still live in the best of all possible worlds, and that the evil is a necessary compartment of having the most good overall? Well, it's at least conceivable that that's the case, but it seems that it's inconceivable that we're living in the most evil imaginable world, because that would just be complete suffering all the time and everywhere.
You'd think so, yes. And so from that point of view, I think that's probably a good way of putting it. Sure. Probably about
but before we get there, I want to ask you a question, which is this. If we were roommates, right, and that would be great fun, one of the first disagreements we might have would be which colour to paint the walls of our new room, and we're having a debate about it. Now, it transpires that you love the colour blue. It is your favourite colour, and to the extent that you think everything should be blue, like it's your favourite colour for the walls. Yeah. And I agree with you. As it happens, I also think that blue is the best color, right? The logical next step is, well, okay, let's paint the room blue. At that point, if we were having that conversation, would you turn around to me and say, well, hold on, Alex, can we just make sure that our love of blue is actually grounded in something more than just our opinion? Or is it enough to say, well, look, we both agree that the color's blue, so it's as though it's objectively true that we should paint the room blue. It kind of follows from that. And we don't need to worry about the fact that we might be mistaken in our love for blue, because we both agree in it. And so it doesn't actually matter. And no one's going to be upset if we paint the room. Everyone's going to be happy. It's going to be fine. Would you have a problem with the fact that that's not grounded in something more?
In that case, no, because it's a somewhat trivial point. You know, blue doesn't have a moral dimension, our preference of the colour blue. If you are asking, hey, we both agree that child abuse is fine, and hey, it turns out everyone else in the world agrees with that, so I guess it's fine. That obviously would be a problem, because then we've got to say, hang on, just because we all agree on this doesn't mean it's necessarily true.
But would it be a problem in the sense that, like, if everybody around you agrees that God exists, and from that they derive propositions like let's not torture babies?
I don't think they do. I think that's the wrong direction, though. I don't think people...
You think it goes the other way?
I don't think people derive the belief we shouldn't torture babies from believing in God. I believe people know we shouldn't torture babies, and they apprehend that as an objective fact about reality. And then you point that out to them and say, is there a grounding for that? The best grounding I can see is God, because naturalism doesn't do it.
Interesting.
So I don't see that you argue for God and then say, oh, and then we get objective values. Yeah. You say, I see that there are objective values. I may not have a belief in God at this point, but I know plenty of atheists who believe in objective values. And then I would simply say, but you're inconsistent if you believe in objective values and you don't believe in God.
So like epistemologically it works in that direction. It's the moral belief takes you to the knowledge of God.
Yeah, I don't think you can ground the moral belief without there being an underlying...
Yeah, but you still think... But the belief
that
itself does come from God.
Well, I believe that, in a sense, that everything comes from God. Ultimately, yes.
Except for evil.
Well, I'd say that evil is the result of God allowing freedom.
Alex raises a question that philosophers have debated for over 2,000 years. Are actions good because God commands them? Or does God command them because they are already good? If morality only becomes good because God says so, then morality becomes arbitrary. God could have declared anything good, even cruelty. But if something is good independently of God, then morality does not actually require God in the first place. Justin responds by saying that goodness is simply part of God's nature. But that explanation raises another issue. Saying good is God does not really explain where moral rules come from. It just attaches the word good to a divine being. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill and modern thinkers like Sam Harris argue that moral systems can be built around human well-being and the reduction of suffering. In that framework, we evaluate actions by their real effects on people rather than by divine commands. I've got to say, this debate is great to watch. It's calm, respectful, and packed with ideas that really make you think. Conversations like this are helpful because they let both sides explain their reasoning without shouting or talking past each other. Now, I'm curious what you think. After hearing these arguments, who here would actually choose to be a Christian? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoy breakdowns like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There's still a lot more in this discussion, including a deep conversation about evil and suffering. So if you'd like us to continue breaking down the rest of the debate, tell us in the comments and we'll cover the next segment.